Hello, and welcome to this 21 CSLA Research Practice webinar. My name is Rebecca Chung, and I'm the Executive Director of the Leadership Programs at the Graduate School of Education at UC Berkeley, and also the Director of 21 CSLA. It is our pleasure to have you with us today for this important topic and discussion. 21 CSLA is a project entitled the California School Leadership Academy. In this project, we focus on professional learning and support of California's educational leaders, teachers, site, and district to create more equitable learning environments that ultimately improve success for underserved students. Headquartered at UC Berkeley Graduate School of Education, 21 CSLA is led in partnership with UCLA School of Education, the California Subject Matter Projects, and the 7 regional academies across the state. Next slide, please. 21 CSLA is sponsored by 3 state-level agencies: the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, the California Department of Education, and the State Board of Education. Please advance 2 slides. Before we begin the main topic of our conversation today, we would like to take a moment to welcome everyone and simultaneously reflect on the current state of education in our schools, in our state, and also in our nation. While we may have been socially distant for over 12 months, many social issues and movements have continued to grow during this time. The images on this slide represent only a few of the public debates that we have engaged in through socially distanced formats, including today's webinar. We believe that educational leaders have the opportunity to make progress on righting the wrongs of race through the development of a critical perspective that better understands the historic and underlying frames, contexts, and orientations that play into the root issues in our current society. We offer this webinar as a starting place for public conversation about how educational leaders can right the wrongs of race. By engaging with a scholar and 3 practitioners, and also all of you, we hope to begin a discussion in the next hour and a half. We won't finish the discussion in the hour and a half, but we hope to activate some ideas, frames, reframes, and inspiration about how you can engage in this work. We will use Zoom polls in this webinar to engage our audience, and we also encourage you as participants to engage with presenters throughout the conversation through the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat, and I'll be raising some of the questions that arise in the chat in the dialogue among the leaders. Next slide. We are honored to have as our guest scholar and researcher, Professor Dr. Jabari Mahiri, who is a professor in the School of Education at UC Berkeley. He is a scholar in critical studies of race, class, and gender, and the Brinton Family Chair of Urban Teaching. Dr. Mahiri is also the faculty advisor and an instructor for the Graduate School of Education at Berkeley's leadership programs and a member of the leadership team for 21 CSLA. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Mahiri. And let's begin on slide 7 with Dr. Mahiri's comments as a start to this webinar.
Welcome, everyone. It's so good to have you all here. And as Dr. Chung has said, this is just the beginning of a conversation. We work with these issues every day. We're not saying that we have the answers, but we do have some ideas, and we want to share those with you today. And I'll just begin by reading this because I want to make sure the framing is exactly how I intended it to be. Educational leaders can significantly contribute to righting the wrongs of race by enabling new racial literacies that include a transformative model of an idea of race, idea being an acronym, to guide conceptual changes of racial identity and diversity and to motivate behavioral changes for racial equity and affinity. I also listed a number of recent works that I've been working on that have accentuated some of these ideas, have documented some of these ideas as recently as this spring. A piece coming out called New Racial Literacies in the Digital Age, and another piece called Deconstructing Race, Prerequisites to Belonging. There are a number of pieces then that, for me, are undergirding the ideas that I'm going to be presenting in the next 20 minutes or so before we go to some of the other presenters who are here to help us in this conversation today. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, we want you to just take a quick poll, and it's just a true or false poll. So if you could just go ahead and I think the poll has just been put forth on the screen. Do your true and false and then submit that, please.
I see that many people are turning in their responses. I will end the poll in about 30 seconds. And I'll be ending the poll shortly. Would you like me to flash the results?
It would be great to flash the results.
Okay, 49 of 56. Here we go.
All right. So for this group here, one of the things that we are saying collectively is that, and this is one of the things that we argue, most of our most pressing problems in the United States, and we can also argue across the globe, although it gets different terminology across the globe, are rooted in race. And I think that this is what our poll is saying, that we all essentially agree with that statement. Okay, so if we can move to the next slide, please. So I'm going to have a 90-second video. And part of the reason for us having this conversation of Asian Americans on race is that I want you to be aware that we put this workshop together and designed the structure for how we're going to address these issues well before the recent horrific incidents that occurred at the beginning of last week and also just in the last day or two in terms of these horrific shootings that have been going on that are coded in race. Our purpose in using this little 90-second video is twofold. Is to begin to give us a bit of what I'm calling, if we're talking about a new racial literacy, some of the terminology that I think is associated with a new racial literacy, and it's part of that is covered in some of the conversations that these different groups of Asian Americans are talking about their experiences of race. And secondly, I also wanted to get away from the unfortunate binary of race. And we know why that occurs based on a sort of black-white binary that comes out of colonialism, that comes out of slavery. It's way more complicated and complex and nuanced. And so I thought it would be an interesting way to begin through a window of Asian Americans having a conversation about race. So if we could go ahead and move that to full screen and play it, and then we'll have an opportunity to come back to some of these ideas in the discussion section.
I think the conversations that I had about race with my family was primarily led by my dad, and it would just be in little lessons. Like I'd pick up the phone and I'd say hello, and he goes, "I can tell you're Korean over the phone." I was like, "It's because I am Korean and I'm on the phone with you." And he goes, "No, no one should be able to tell you're Korean on the phone. People should just think you're American."
When my parents talked about Americans, they clearly meant white Americans. When they meant any other kind of Americans, they named them. They said Black people or Latinos or Native American Indians was the language they would use for Native people.
Wearing this skin color is a big deal to me. you know, which is why I don't say I'm just American anymore, because I'm not, because America doesn't see me as just American.
My first experience with race was when I was 6 years old. I fell in love with this girl named Janice, and I went up to her in the sandbox, and I was like, Janice, I love you. And she was like, you're the color of poop. And that was memory number one with like racism. And I didn't know what that was. I just took that literally. I was like, what? No, it's not rubbing off. Like, it was very terrifying.
When you looked at more deeply within our own communities and how we play our role and how we're treated even differently within colorism and the spectrum of our skin tone, you know, Vietnamese people are treated differently and better than Cambodians or Lao people or Hmong people because we're lighter. And I think with our own communities, we have to acknowledge that privilege of our skin color, and how we play a role being complacent and not being complacent and fighting back against what the system is between white supremacy and anti-Blackness and everything in between the systems that upholds those two.
If we could go to the next slide.
I think the conversation.
So I know you're going to want to jump in on a conversation about this conversations on race, but please hold your ideas, write your thoughts down. We do have a discussion section coming right after this, but if we can go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that conversation that those people had about race invoked for me is some terminology that we often don't address in relationship to understanding what I would argue is a new racial literacy. And so we know that race is not a scientific fact, but it is a social fact with a violent history and hierarchy of oppression perpetrated by the ideology and practices of white supremacy. And we want to make it clear that we make a separation between white supremacy and people who are identified as white, either identified as white or self-identify as white. But at the same time, a part of the legacy of white supremacy is this concept that the woman at the very end began to address just briefly, a notion of pigmentocracy, a hierarchy of color coding of racialized oppression. And we all have had experiences of that or have witnessed experiences of that. We want to make a case too that in light of this notion of pigmentocracy, ultimately, because race is not a scientific fact, skin is actually illegible, that we are not able to read or distinguish the actual racial positioning of an individual person based on skin color. And what that begins to upend and what that begins to deconstruct is the basic 5 color-coded categories that white supremacy has aligned in a spectrum with whiteness on one end and Blackness on the other end, and other unfortunate color-coded categories placed in between. So we want to just push a little bit on this notion of the illegibility of skin, and we're going to have a little poll coming up in a second to see if we can see if this is in fact true. And microcultures is sort of a concept that I came up with that's at the base of the book, Deconstructing Race, which came out in 2017. But it tries to say that if this is not true, if we don't have these localized, standardized, color-coded categories that we operate out of, and that's all that race is, then how do we get at more of the nuance, more of the specificity, more of the uniqueness of the characteristics of each individual in terms of their positionality, their practices, their choices, and their perspectives. And then this interesting idea of the archaeology of self. If we all were able to excavate the legacies, the histories that brought us to this moment, that would help us to get into a sense of a better understanding of our microcultural positioning inside the larger categories of racial dynamics. And finally, for me, an important consideration for new terminology, new terms associated with a new racial literacy is othering and belonging. Coming from the Institute, the Haas Institute for Race that's here on UC Berkeley's campus, and John Powell and others, and they have a conference every year. It'd be interesting for you to attend if you want to pursue this further, but it gives us more nuanced terminology than a sort of broad brushstrokes of oppression and marginalization, et cetera, that basically most of the dynamics that occur between human beings can be expressed through processes of either othering or belonging. And of course, in their article with the same title, they argue a little bit like W.B. Du Bois started out saying the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. They say that the problem of the 21st century is a problem of othering. And of course, the solution is one of belonging, racial healing, but even beyond racial healing, the last A in our idea of race, how do we move toward a concept of racial affinity? So we're gonna move to the next slide and have a little test. One of these young women is my daughter. I want you to weigh in on whether you think it's the woman on the left, the woman in the center, or the woman in the right. They're all you see Santa Barbara students, and we just want you to poll in and see if you can guess which one is my daughter.
There's a box covering up the picture.
Can we move the box over?
Perfect, thank you.
The poll is sort of covering up the picture. Is it possible to move the poll over?
Yes, the poll's been moved and we have about 20 responses so far. We'll keep this poll open for another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll see which one is Dr. Meharry's daughter. 10 more seconds. Okay, here we go. According to the audience, any of them could be your daughter. I think the poll is in the middle of the slide deck.
Can we? I can't.
Let's see, here you go. 35% left, 29% center, 35% right.
All right. 35% of you are right. And that's the ones who selected the young woman on the right. Can we move the poll now and just leave the slide where it is, please, so that we can see the faces? For me, the poll is covering one of the faces.
You may have
Okay,
to
maybe.
close. Yeah.
Okay, then don't worry. The interesting thing about this, and I've used this in presentations before, it was always had to be by a show of hands, and we just sort of guesstimate. The outcomes would almost always be the same. Let's say if I've done this 20 times, the outcomes are pretty much exactly what we have voted. About 33% feel that one on the left is my daughter. About another third feel that the person in the center is my daughter. And the other third feel that the person on the right is my daughter. The interesting thing to me about this is these are roommates. They say they're hanging together. My daughter sent this to me and said, you know, here's a picture of me hanging out with my friends. So of course, we're in a new digital age, and what they consider to be hanging out is very different from what we might as older people consider to be hanging out. But for them, that is. The woman on the left is a Latina woman. The woman in the right, in the middle, is Indian, Southeast Asian. And the woman on the right is my daughter. If we could go back to those two, slide again. Fine. So what's interesting is that I would drive down to Santa Barbara and pick Nia up, and we would drive back and we'd have conversations about how things were going on campus for her. And one day I asked, you know, there are only 3% African Americans on your campus. What do people think you are? And she said, you know, and she's a biology major, psych biology major, and very good in math. She said, Dad, people think I'm Indian because I'm good in math and science. They just assume that I'm Indian. So this notion that we would let frames, when we talk about reframing race, the way race gets framed around different kinds of, somebody's phone was on, it wasn't mine, and things like that is the point of this. Okay, so illegible skin is one of the terminology, one of the terms that I think we would incorporate into a concept of a new racial literacy. If we can move on to the next slide, please. seem to be a little bit frozen on our slides. There we go. I don't, can we close the poll, by the way?
Yeah, there's still a box obscuring the slide.
Yeah, I think we have to close the poll.
I think, Rebecca, you need to close the poll because I don't have that.
Ah. All right,
Is it the chat box?
oops. There we go. Okay, so this National Geographic cover came out about a year ago. And if it were difficult to determine which of these young women on the previous slide was my daughter, imagine the variability of, just how people come into existence in the world. These young women are twins, and they, would not necessarily be seen as even sisters. So it's just another reference to the notion of a kind of illegible skin. Okay, so let's move on. As I mentioned before, part of our issue is in this notion of a black-white binary. And that's part of what clouds and requires a consideration for reframing race. I'm just going to read this. Some scholars have argued that Black is an identity that one adopts, but more accurately, Black is an identity that is ascribed by and intricately dependent upon how it is projected in contrast to whiteness. I've even made the case that Blackness as a color-coded identity was created by whiteness, that white supremacy as it rolled out of the blocks in the United States in the early 1600s and 1620s, with the English being the most powerful group at that time, setting the framework in place for what will to become the implications and historical manifestations of white supremacy, began to define the concept of whiteness, that although it appeared to be a fairly rigid consideration, we know from the evolution of this country that even that concept of who got identified as white was one that was continually expanding. There's a very good book that talks about the continual expansion of the notion of whiteness, who got included in it, the Irish, the Jews, the Germans, the Italians, over periods of time. They all had been considered not in the central consideration of what the society at that time was considering to be white, with the most recent instance being at the end of World War II, Jewish people being brought into the cloak of what is identified as whiteness. Okay, so when I make this point, I often get a lot of pushback, and maybe there will be some questions that come up in the discussion, but this notion that Blackness as a racial definer, even though there's still a concept that people can adopt a term and air out the negative aspects of the signifier and reinfuse it with positive associations, still not interesting for us to understand, I think, historically, that it emerged as a way of actually providing the parameters for how whiteness itself was defined. Blackness was what whiteness was not. If we can move on. So another way of looking at this is that I talk about the prisms or prisms of racial identity. And even when we think about multicultural diversity, we realize that sort of like a spectrum that gets divided into various colors coming from white light, that even in the concept of how we are looking at the classifications of race inside the United States, the divisions of those different colors on the spectrum are still emanating out of the white light of white supremacy. And I don't necessarily want to hold to that term white light, but let's move to the next slide, please. So racism is interpersonal, it's also institutional. We could talk about environmental racism, but one of the things, and this is what's so important for us as educators, is to realize how so many subtle aspects of racial inequality are perpetuated through the very institutions that we are leaders of. We could deal with this in the context of the institution of education specifically, but I wanted to look at the institution of the census as another way that the divisions of race and a old literacy of race. When we talk about a new racial literacy, it's implied that there is also an old racial literacy. And the old racial literacy, I would argue, is the one that we're operating out of for the most part now, which still by default honors the privilege and positionality and top of hierarchy of whiteness. So in 1790, after the country had just come into existence, the census came into, was brought into play. And even though we can't follow this line all the way from 1790 to 2020, what we would have found if we were able to, and this line actually does continue itself all the way out, what we would find is that the concept of white in the census has not changed in that entire time period. Where, as we see, if we were to follow this line out, other groups come in, Asians come in, Latinos come in, Hispanics come in. Actually, in the 2020 census, Hispanics are no longer considered a race. So you may have encountered that when you were doing the census for 2020, that it was interesting that it was really an indication of the multicultural nature of us all, but because the Spanish issue was so complicated, with 23 countries in the world speaking Spanish, and yet the differentiality of their cultural backgrounds being so diverse that they could no longer claim that as a central race as they have done earlier. So the notion here is that from 1790 to 2000, let's say 2010, it's changed a little bit in the most recent census. The reification of whiteness as a separate category, where all of the other categories were delineated and redefined over time to be consistent with what the white category felt it needed in order to continue to be a sort of majority and in domination and control. Okay, I know we're moving toward the end of the time that we have, but I just want to make a couple more points on the next two slides, and then we're gonna turn it over to our illustrious school leaders. But I think there's a slide. Oh no, I guess yeah, I guess we're ready to move into that space right now. So I'll just turn it over to Dr. Chung again.
Great. So we're really, thank you so much. You just gave us the most abbreviated short course on on your research, and I hope that all of you will take a look at the slide deck and review some of the concepts that have been presented today. We're now really honored to invite two leaders in California schools to join in our dialogue about how California leaders now situating this into schools and school leadership and district leadership, how leaders right the wrongs of race. Please join me in welcoming Tariq Smith, who is a restorative justice coordinator at Carver Middle School in the Los Angeles Unified School District, as well as Neha Umad, who is the principal of West Oakland Middle School in the Oakland Unified School District. We've invited each leader to give a short presentation on and share some ideas related to how they see themselves righting the wrongs of race from their various perspectives. And after they share, we will engage in a dialogue across all of the different presenters as well as our audience members. So I'll turn it over to Tariq.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here, and really enjoyed the thoughts that have been shared already. So I'm just gonna talk a little bit about who I am and the work that I do. I think that's a tall order that was mentioned in terms of righting the racial wrongs. I don't know if I'm quite in that category, but I think that my work starts around the idea of what I can control, and that's like the imagery and the learning and the way that learning is framed in my school and in the curriculum that, you know, I essentially have control over. This is some data about my school. I actually think the most important thing about my school is that it is located very close to the Central Avenue corridor, which was a hub of jazz in the like from the 1930s to the 1950s, a super important historical place. And again, I feel like a lot of times when we describe Black areas, we kind of leave out all of the culture and the richness and the various ways that our neighborhoods thrive. So I always like to point that out. If we could go ahead and go to the next slide. I wanted to just talk a little bit about kind of what started me on this journey in a different way. I've been in charge of the SEL curriculum at our school for a while, and I would say SEL/RJ is definitely not just me, so I don't want to take all the credit. I usually do my best work in teams, but when I first got to Carver, our charge was to really work on a school-wide curriculum for our advisory and to make it meaningful. And, you know, I feel like we've done that. And I'm going to give you a look at a few things. But first, I kind of want to talk about this Dina Simmons quote quickly. If we don't apply a racial equity lens, a racial lens, an abolitionist lens, then very easily SEL becomes white supremacy with a hug. This is part of a video, and I can put the link in the chat later. If I put it in now, everybody's probably gonna start watching a video, so I'm gonna wait. So this quote I came across in this webinar this summer as we were in kind of like the height of all of the racial tension. And you know, just kind of, I was already kind of on fire, and it really just kind of kept me going and really had me rethinking everything that we do at our school. You know, and as the person who was in charge of SEL, like really holding myself accountable. How do I make sure that we're not just doing white supremacy with a hug, right? And not having analysis around race. So that was kind of what informed me. You know, I did some pretty uncomfortable stuff around anti-Blackness, and that was kind of how we kicked off the PD. That video and this quote was somewhat of a linchpin for beginning our work this year and like framing the SEL work that I was doing. And then we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So the next two slides I'm going to show you are from the Black History Month lessons that we were doing. And, you know, I personally have real mixed feelings about Black History Month. I think, you know, as much as it's important to learn about Black history, I think oftentimes the way that it's done is, you know, terribly sanitized and not necessarily super useful for people of color and especially Black folks. So my goal was to kind of rethink that for this. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of these images, and then I think I can turn it over to Neha. Looking at the images on this screen, just giving you like a little bit of context for some of these, because this was like a review slide for things that we had done over the month. You can see that the goal here was to kind of recontextualize Black imagery and to do that in a way that's affirming and meaningful for people of color and especially Black folks. The first image is actually from photographer Etinosa Yvonne, and obviously it shows that connectedness, right, of the struggle that has been going on for decades and centuries. And it actually connects to other lessons we've done. We have another lesson where Angela Davis is talking about radical self-care and kind of like normalizing that for Black folks, which I think is kind of a revolutionary thing. The next picture is from a photographer named Michael McCoy. And, I think there's a way in which when Black people are creating art or curating images of Black people, it feels different. It's affirming. And when we think about how often our images are weaponized against us, it is important to me to kind of like show alternatives to that. There's obviously we did some work around the Black Panthers, and it still kind of shocks me how much they are described as a violent Black nationalist, radical, whatever code words we use, right, for dangerous and to be gotten rid of, right? So I think the part that's left out is how much work they did around healthcare, food insecurity, education. And so we kind of recontextualize that for our students during these lessons. We see the hip hop pose, and that's a still image taken from a B-boy video. And again, I think it's really important for our kids to get other ideas of their story and their history. And, hip hop and B-boying is like a very clear example of how Black folks and Afro Latinos have created their own stories, even with their bodies. And funny, in this video, there's a young guy who says, hip hop is about giving back in some kind of way, culturally, economically, spiritually, and philosophically. So I feel like those kinds of things are really important to show to our children. I'm going to speed up a little bit here. I know obviously you guys are familiar with the sit-ins of the 50s and 60s. And if you could go ahead and go to the next slide. So these are more images that we were reviewing during this week of lessons. In the top left corner is it was taken from a video by someone who's talking about one of his idols, Phase 2, who was a really important graffiti legend, and how that person inspired him to tell his story. He also talked about how therapeutic art can be, and art as a form of self-care. The next one you see there is an image of Emory Douglas from the Black Panther newsletter. And then the next one on the bottom left is a still from a video about the origins of Boogaloo in Oakland. I'm just realizing now that this is kind of a Bay Area leaning presentation here. I swear I'm not pandering to all of you. And then it also shows to me just how everything is connected. It's about voice and owning that voice, the way that these people in the video talk about their identity and self-expression as a way of overcoming oppression is a beautiful thing. And I'm assuming most of you are familiar with these images from Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherald. I think it's really important that our students see that remixing the imagery of, even people that we think we know, right? And again, the idea of how luxurious it is, and how affirming it can be to see these images that are curated by people who are inside of our culture or who are in agreement or in congruence, with positive imagery around Blackness. And so the beautiful thing too about these lessons is that we always include a lot of videos, and there's a lot of voice where the people who are presenting their art or their story have control over that narrative. And again, I just feel like that's super important for our children to be exposed to that as much as possible. That the idea that like Blackness can be centered in a positive way in your understanding of the world and the context around you. So I hope that makes sense. I was trying to figure out a way to contextualize the work that I do in a short and succinct way. And hopefully, you know, if you have questions, we can talk about that more later. But that's it from me.
Thank you, Tariq. And I encourage you, anybody who has questions or connections to Tariq's presentation, please engage in the chat as we turn it over to Neha to hear about West Oakland Middle School.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for having me this afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. My name is Neha Umad. I am the principal at West Oakland Middle School in Oakland, California. I've been the principal here for 6 years, and I love the community. I love being here. The focus of the presentation is around righting the wrongs of race, and we have been working as a school to think about how we do that. We are a Black and brown school. We are, like you can see in the demographics, vast majority Title I. And just to be super real, we are a hyper segregated school in a Bay Area city in Oakland, where most of the schools are really segregated, not by law, but because of a variety of different factors that have impacted the neighborhood of West Oakland as well as Deep East Oakland for many years. And it definitely has an impact on the schools. But instead of kind of having a deficit frame around it, the people at our school and the staff at our school love serving our community, and we love our students, and we try to hold high expectations for them. And at the same time, we realize that we are in a space where we are under-resourced and we are segregated. And we also know that a lot of the issues that come with Black and brown schools, we have bought into some of the deficit mindset, some white supremacy culture pieces that happen with students, especially middle school students. As a staff, we've discussed our issues of disproportionality for special education students, issues with suspensions, thinking about which students are really shining, which students are performing, as well as, looking at the typical on-paper data. But one of the things that we are really thinking about, and what I appreciated about this year, despite all of its challenges, is that in distance learning, we were able to slow down a bit as adults and thinking about how we can take this opportunity that we will probably never get again in our lifetimes, to rethink about what our school could look like. This spring, right now, we're in the midst in Oakland to think about how we're reopening schools. And a few of my teachers have asked about, well, students are coming back and some of them have never been there. Maybe we should provide a refresher. And I wanted to correct in the sense of, we don't want to provide a refresher in some ways because we don't want to go back to the way things were, because if we want to be super honest, we're not necessarily happy with everything the way it was. And the way we framed it all year is to think about creating norms in our school that are anti-racist. And we started with our adult culture. And we just thought about how we could redo school in a way that's not soaked in the implicit norms of white supremacy culture. So our staff attended some trainings as well as doing some reading. We created an anti-racist task force at our school made up of a variety of adults on our campus, and thinking about what we do in school, because we are in this institution, how the norms just come up in our institution every single day. Whether it's around the type of, as far as in the adult culture, the type of people we always shout out, the people and their behaviors and the type of things that we do, the way in which we hold our meetings, the way in which we make decisions, the way in which we appreciate each other or don't appreciate each other. So talking about some of the places where we could take apart the idea of having one right way to do things, having an either or mindset, being perfectionist. So we've talked about having more of a growth mindset, having different stances, and appreciating the many things that people bring to the table. and we've created anti-racist norms. The next step right now for us is thinking about how we translate that to students and families and how we bring that to our school. I think the thing in middle schools in particular is thinking about how it relates to school culture and climate. We definitely want to think about this narrative around school discipline, where it's about students being controlled or adult controlling students' bodies, students listening to the adult at all times. How are you listening to the instructions? And I'm the adult, so what I say goes, and students having to fear and respect equaling fear. So it is very interesting to have this discussion because literally half an hour ago I was in a meeting where we're talking about reopening and people are asking, well, what are the consequences for our students when they don't wear masks, that they're going to come back, and if they're not wearing masks, can we write a contract so that parents know that if they don't wear their masks and then they're off campus? And it's a very difficult place to be in as a principal when you're trying to make sure that when you are trying to ensure that your staff is safe and at the same time not continue to practice the punitive exclusionary tactics that may have worked for you in the short term, in previous years, but we know aren't going to be healthy. So we are discussing it. We're saying, again, it's not just because you are saying you're not going to, expel the child for that day, or, send the student home because they're not going to listen to you the first time. It doesn't mean you're being soft. We can have, again, it's not an either or thing. So having the both and stance where we're saying we have to educate, they have to understand the science behind the mask, they have to understand what it's like, we have to practice incorporating COVID friendly PBIS system is going to be important. All of that is important. And again, thinking about how much we spent time in the past around controlling student bodies and thinking about how we want students to actually be joyful and be respected. And there's definitely a balance, especially when we're talking about coming back during COVID, because there's going to be social distancing, masks, and all of that. So that's very much at top of mind for many of our staff. And we have to collaborate and work together and be very vigilant about how we address that situation. And then from the instructional perspective, thinking about how we decolonize our curriculum, how we use pedagogy and veer from the scope and sequence at times if it really not serving our students. We have a group of teachers who are really delving into project-based learning, and as a staff, we're thinking about what's the investment of our time. Is some of the time, if we really want to make engaging lessons for our students, and this year has definitely tested that because students can be at home with a million different distractions, what's really made them engaged, what's helped them actually have joy in their learning. And we actually have seen quite a few examples of students respond and respond really positively to projects that engage them in who they are as people. So having humanizing curriculum that sees them and gets a chance to give them voice and choice. So we are excited about those opportunities. And it's a big job, part of the big issues, because sometimes when you're working with the staff and adults and you have students in front of you, or you're anticipating the students are going to be in front of you, people want an answer like immediately. Well, what are we going to do if this happens? Or how is this going to happen? And what if this process doesn't work? And even with adults, what if they don't feel like the norm is being upheld? How are we going to take care of it right then and there? And I think that the difficult space to be in, again, is to let people know that things are not going to be perfect immediately. And it takes a process of building relationships with each other and with our students. So that's kind of the main points of what I wanted to discuss, but I think there are questions in the chat. Are we to answer the questions in the chat right now, or how do we want to do it?
Yeah, thank you, Neha. And we're going to invite, we're going to spotlight Tariq and Dr. Mahiri and bring all of us into a dialogue. We're going to have a time to discuss, and then we're going to move to some closing remarks from Dr. Mahiri. So I'll just wait for, here we go. Here he is. This is our webinar format. You don't move. It just the spotlight has to come, and then we'll wait for Tariq. Here he is. Hello. And so thank you all for sharing, and especially for taking time out of your busy schedule. I'll moderate the chat for you a bit. I want to start by really trying to make some connections between the work that you're doing in your schools and the work that Dr. Mahiri presented. So specifically, he was talking about, as you know, a lot of the hierarchies that we have and some of the constraints of the way that we have developed this racial lens in schools and how it could constrain us from liberation. And I'd love to hear your thoughts as practitioners about how you see that playing out in your schools or in your leadership. For instance, the issue of gentrification came up, I think, in both of your schools. And that could, from a racial perspective, present a lot of challenges and tensions, where in a reframe, it could present opportunity if we applied some of Dr. Mahiri's research. Is there somebody who'd like to make a comment about that?
I mean, it impacts us very heavily in Oakland. We're in West Oakland, which, borders on, it's right across the bridge from San Francisco. So we're really being impacted. And it's impacting the families that are moving in who are not considering the neighborhood public school. There are other schools in the district that are maybe in the hills. There's an open enrollment policy that allows for people to try to get into that lottery. And, those schools are more integrated. There are private schools and charter schools that we're surrounded by. And one of the pieces in Oakland is there is a march towards, trying to close certain schools. And a lot of those schools have Black students in them. And it's a very hotly political issue right now.
Tariq, several people in the chat, in the audience, asked questions about uplifting the perspectives and the self-care of African American students as a small group in your school. So your school is a school that has a long history with African Americans in Los Angeles, but now the student population has changed. Have you noticed tensions when you use the approach that you've used, and/or opportunities as a leader to help push forward the deconstruction of race through these strategies?
I mean, I'm sure there's underlying tension. I mean, I don't really stop to slow down on that too much. I mean, I feel like it's pretty obvious, the struggle and the location for that struggle in our school, and the reality of our data in terms of the success of our Black students. It definitely speaks to the opportunity gap that Ladson Billings always talks about. And so, I think the way that I address it at my school is thinking about our Black students. And I almost feel ashamed mentioning this book, but I could never get out of my head. We read Miner's Canary as a part of the PLI program, and that, as much as we want to get away from the binary, right? I think that binary is very limiting in ways. I do think that paying attention to the most marginalized students, in our school, which is still our Black kids, and as a Black student, you can have a whole multitude of other identities as well. So there's a lot of intersectionality there. But the reality is that we still need to be doing better for them. And I think that the majority of our teachers are pretty efficacious about that, and realize that, equity means paying attention to what needs to be paid attention to. One of the things that I do at my school that I feel like helps with that is just really addressing kind of like the issues around race in a more nuanced way, and pushing back against like the kind of oversimplified conversations that we always have. I feel like as much as race is, and this is Ladson Billings as well, as much as race is a salient concept in our country, right? It's still very untheorized, and so it's over discussed and still not comprehended to the degree that it needs to be. And I think I'm constantly framing it that way. So we need to learn, right? We need to really Yeah, we need to learn. I mean, we need to also dismantle all these systems, but I don't have that power. So I work on the part that we can do, right?
I wonder, as a follow-up, if I could ask you to describe when in the lessons in particular and in the imagery or in your curriculum, as you described, Neha, the decolonizing of curriculum, how do your students respond to that? And how do you build the capacity of educators to do that work?
It's something that I find interesting and fun. I was a high school history teacher for a while before I became an administrator, and I'm thinking of one teacher in particular, where it has for some people it's not a natural thing always to think about how curriculum can connect to students immediately. Like some teachers are super excited about their content just for what it is and just get excited about it and assume implicitly that students will be excited about it as well. So doing some work individually and working with a coach on staff, or working and coaching the staff directly about thinking about what an 11, 12, 13-year-old would find interesting about whatever the topic is. And it doesn't mean you put and I think there was a question in the chat around how many staff do we have of color. Our staff is majority Black and brown staff. However, we have to remember that age plays a role as well. Like there's an age culture as well. And I think that some teachers are super excited about their content for what it is, but don't always realize that they have to spark that with students explicitly. So there's some of that work, and I think when that does happen, and we've seen it happen, then students are really excited about it. Our students get really excited about projects that allow them some voice and allow them to focus on issues that they think are important, like social justice issues that has been exciting for them, and things that are relevant to their life.
Yeah. Going along with what Neha said, that's a pretty summative answer, but I would add, just for my particular context, I think, going into advisories, I think our students respond to what's exciting. I wish that I had created, a few more Black Panthers by the end of Black History Month. That did not happen, but I think that the lessons are structured in a way that it's responsive to what kids are interested in, right? Like they can see, the passion with which, the people that they're looking at are speaking with, right? Like people respond to that passion. They can see like the luxurious palette, of Amy Sherald's work. Like kids are naturally drawn, to the vivid content. And I think that normalizing, Black excellence and Black art, those things pay off over time. It's not like a quick fix, right? But I definitely see the seed being planted, like, oh, she looks like my aunt, and comments like that you get. It's really, it's humbling, and it reminds you that that what you're putting out there in terms of imagery, what you're putting out there in terms of what is normal, is critical. Even your check-in questions, right? Like, how are you doing today? On a scale of Jay-Z, and different pictures of Jay-Z for his different moods or whatever. I feel like that hits a little bit different for our students.
Well, I want to invite Dr. Mahiri to join this dialogue. What questions do you have for our leaders? I have so many questions, and of course there are many in the chat, but it's most important we hear your questions.
Thanks. Well, we really appreciate our leaders coming on and giving us insights from the inside out. So important, because none of this makes sense until you try to actually bring it into existence in the context of all of the challenges of being in the school place with the diverse stakeholders and the larger dynamics that surround the school. So I guess the question that I have, and Neha, you touched on this a little bit already in terms of like ways that we need to think about transforming the curriculum. But if we assume that issues of diversity are often minimalized around what I was calling the color-coded categories, and someone put a very interesting point into the chat that I want to acknowledge when I was saying that, you know, different groups have been included under the umbrella of whiteness, with the Jewish group being the most recent as of World War II, at the end of World War II. And the chat point was that there are many layers of Jewishness, and that you have Black Jews, you have people who are Arab, who are, you know, adherent to Judaism and things like that. So I appreciate that comment. I just want to say that to whoever it's made, but at the same time, I think it reinforces the fundamental point that I'm making, which is the complexity and nuance of racial positioning is much more intricate than we often get an opportunity to address in the context of teaching and learning in school. And so this would be a challenge for me. It's a challenge for us at 21 CSLA in terms of all of the ways, things we're trying to do in terms of bringing about equity. But if equity is going to be ratcheted down to the unique positionalities of the people who are engaged in the school process, how do we blend that into the curriculum? How do we make curriculums literally, and I don't want to just use this term, off the cuff, but literally multicultural in the sense that it also drills down to the microcultural within the multicultural.
Could you reframe rephrase the question part of it?
The question is, how do we bring some of these issues we've been addressing around limits of ways that the white supremacist system perpetuates race and simplified categories? How do we make that much larger sense of complexity actually available and accessible to our students in particular kinds of curricular offerings, in a science class, in a history class, in a literature class? How does that actually manifest itself?
And if I can just add a little tag on to that, because it's come up a few times in the chat and throughout our conversation, how do we just even have this conversation among the adults? You know, Neha started by saying that they started with the adult culture first. How do we interrogate the system to disabuse these equations that have been made? When we think about bilinguals or English learners, do people make racialized equivalents to the students, for instance? This came up. And how do we celebrate language diversity in a different way but all of this is predicated on educators and the educational system, at least a critical mass of the educational system, being able to interrogate these issues on a consistent basis. How do you have those conversations with your colleagues, with your peers, with your families, with your supervisors, even in cases?
I mean, we're starting with our staff and thinking about what are the things that are most useful for our students. I do think that as a school that, and where we're located and who we are and the fact that we've been underserved means that it's definitely, we have a deficit model. Every time we look at it, it's just like, look at our scores, look at where students are, look at their reading scores, look at their math scores. We have to catch up. This is the scope and sequence, is what we're doing. And, you know, just keep doing. And I think part of what we're saying is what we've been doing doesn't really, you know, work if we're trying to reach these goals. And what we were trying to reframe is that we need some other goalposts as well, not just for us to feel more successful, but also for things to truly be reframed so that they serve the students. So one concrete thing we're doing, and this is not like that revolutionary because schools do it, but for eighth graders to have a graduate profile. Like I feel like all the time from our school district level and the state level, it's okay, this is how your students are doing. This is their SBAC, this is their testing, this is their other on paper, and these are their grades. But one of the conversations we're having just on a regular level, to be real, is what do our grades mean? Do our students know what they do they have an understanding at the end of eighth grade what they can actually do and accomplish? Like what do they feel empowered to say they've learned at the end of the 3 years in middle school? And what this means is that we will have to shift from worrying so much about covering every major standard, I shouldn't say, every major standard in the Common Core, and saying that no, these are the things that really speak to our students. These are the things that we know will serve them in the future. And these are the habits of mind that we have to actually help them learn so that they can speak about a project confidently. They have public speaking skills. They know how to actually present. They know how to write an essay. They know how to collaborate. They know how to use technology to get their point across. So we're in the process of creating a graduate profile, what a portfolio would look like that students would have to defend at the end of eighth grade. Because what we've seen is that the goalposts that we've been chasing after, they don't tell our families anything. They tell them very little, I should say. And we just have to say what's going to work for our kids, because tinkering around the edges is just not working for us.
Tariq, is there something you'd like to add about having conversations with peers, colleagues, other adults about how we change the system to move away from the structural mechanisms that encourage and reinforce these binaries?
Yeah, thank you. I was waiting for you to rephrase the question because I know there's kind of like a lot of questions embedded in the question. I think the work at the schools that I've been at, and I've been at a few because I've been at this for a minute. I think that the work with adults is really around like refusing to get stuck at the opening conversation, and pushing past that and really growing people's racial, I mean, I guess going back to the theme of this, right? Like racial literacy. I think that there is a skill set and a knowledge base around race that we kind of like neglect, right? We don't really think of it in that way because we think of, we've allowed ourselves as a society to find race as, or racism as like a moral issue or like something that you do if you're a bad person. And we have all these really kind of non-functional definitions around race, right? And we get stuck there, and it's kind of a cul-de-sac that I feel like doesn't really allow for advancing. So I think, in work that I do with teachers when I'm trying to get them to really think about that stuff in a new way is really think about their own journey around race, right? Especially for white folks. A lot of times race is framed in a way that it's what other people have to go through, right? But everyone has a story around race and things that they hold as true. I'm not really sure how much those things really are true when you hold them up against, the actual reality or lived experiences, right, of our students. And so I work on that too, right? Getting our teachers to really have some fluency around like what are the lived experiences. And I know that that's important for me too. I think that, the unfortunate reality, I think Neha mentioned that most of her teachers are Black and brown. That's the case at my school as well. And, the unfortunate reality is that, we can do harm as well. So being real about that, owning up to that, even if you are literate in one aspect of your student's identity, you can still be doing harm on other planes of acts, planes or entry points. And so I'm always thinking about that, right? As a cisgender person, as an educated person, as a middle class person, as a bibliophile. I mean, there are all these ways that I'm privileged in education that we need to really be thinking about. So I put myself out there first in that way, and I think that helps with the process. But yeah, that's what comes to mind for me.
Thank you so much. Thanks to both Tariq and Neha. Let's turn it back to Dr. Mahiri for a few closing comments and connections for this dialogue back to his work as a researcher.
Thank you, and thank you all for those. It seems like you guys were on the spot much more than me in terms of this presentation, and it is a difficult presentation, not a difficult presentation, it's a difficult issue to deal with. I think the fundamental question is, if we are engaged in righting the wrongs of race, as many of us are at all kinds of levels, what is the role of educators and educational institutions specifically in this process? And our presenters gave us some great ideas. The notion of knowledge that works for students by the end of middle schools, knowledge and skills that they can actually use in the world, a portfolio of represent documentation of the kinds of things that they learn and are able to do that will allow them to move, through the world with a certain amount of confidence and communicating and projecting their own interests and protecting their own interests. So for me, this notion that was put forth there. The other thing I think is that, particularly around the issue of race, that learning how to talk about it, learning how to deal with it. I think what I wanted to say in terms of the portfolio also is that I would hope that it would also include something that's similar to, if not exactly using the same terminology, of an archaeology of the self, that people have to really investigate how they are racially positioned in the world, both in terms of the identities that are overlaid on them from the outside and the identities that they've embraced and developed internally that represent more authentically, who they are. So this concept of the archaeology of the self is very fundamental to what I would argue is the need for a new racial literacy. It begins with the self, and then with the understanding of that archaeology of the self, not just in the moment, but can people go back 7 generations or more in terms of understanding how you came to be? And once you do, and we are helped with that a little bit with some of the DNA work, but also beginning to think of schooling as a place where students' voice is amplified around their archaeology of self through strategies in the classrooms, whether social studies, English, even science classrooms, where they're asked to be ethnographers of their own family and community experiences, where they become agents of investigating how they came to be by inquiring of their parents and of their parents' parents, relatives and cousins and others, what their experiences of coming to this moment has been in terms of shaping them as an individual in that moment and being able to amplify this. Looking at multiple dimensions of difference. In other words, we often collapse, as I've argued, difference into simplified categories of race without really exploring the vast range of dimensions of difference, age, of geography, of gender, as Tariq was also saying, the privileged voices that we have when we look at those things, but understanding how that might manifest itself from the student's perspective, so that these multiple dimensions, language, immigration status, all of these dimensions of difference are part of what constitutes each individual in the society and each individual in the school place, and makes for the microcultural positioning that is underlying this argument that's being made. So the Science Museum in St. Paul about 2 decades ago had a exhibition that then traveled all over the country. And it was essentially an exhibition that raised the question, race, are we so different? And again, in addition to the idea of resisting the oppression of racial hierarchies, we also have to understand where we need to move, collaborate, not just being allies, but it's in all of our interests to move to some considerations of racial affinity, even beyond racial equity. How do we not only deal equitably with each other, but at the same time begin to appreciate and gain affinities for different groups along all of the dimensions of difference, okay? And that's partially tied to being proximal. And we would hope that the school system offers us these opportunities for different people with different backgrounds and experiences to get proximal. But in actuality, the segregation of the school system has reinforced, ways that people are continue to be isolated, from each other, often for very intentional reasons. And so that becomes a problem also. So to sort of bringing this all to a close, and this notion of the problem of the 21st century being the problem of othering, I just wanted to maybe close on the next slide. I mean, you can read this in terms of that being a better terminology, but if we can move to the next slide, I think it gets to this concept of how do we move toward a sense of racial affinity. So if you were a science teacher, if you were a middle school teacher at multiple subjects at any level, and people were coming into your classroom and making the case that the earth is flat, as a science teacher, you would probably have a desire to disabuse them of the erroneousness of that orientation, right? And so, if we can go to the next slide, my argument is a little bit similar in terms of race. And in other words, since we know that race is not a scientific fact, but it is a social fact with all of these disastrous consequences. When I mentioned that museum experience, it broke the exhibition into three categories. One was the experience of race, one was the history of race, and one was the science of race. And so when you went through several of the exhibitions and you were just in the science of race, you were just getting all of this information about how unscientific contemporary orientations toward race are. But at the same time, there is a experience of race that is very real because it is a social construct that has disastrous consequences. And we see those disastrous consequences in the entire history of race in this country. So I think our question is, how do we use schooling to transform both the experiences of race and the understanding of the experiences of race such that it changes the history of race to be more in line with what we know to be the science of race, all right? Meaning that race is an idea, race is not a scientific fact, and as a consequence, it's one of the ways that difference and division is upheld and propagated in society. And until we deconstruct that, then we're not really in a position to move forward toward a notion of racial equity or racial affinity or righting the wrongs of race. It involves then flattening the hierarchies and transform, the hierarchy of race, the pigmentocracies that we talked about at the front end of the presentation, and moving into an arena where we have a greater sense of a circle of racial affinity, a circle of racial compassion, a circle of racial empathy, a circle of racial belonging. And that's why this notion of othering and belonging become more powerful terms for me, because when we start to ask, what does it require for us to develop a sense of belonging at the highest level in the nation state, but belonging in our state, belonging in our communities, belonging in our family, belonging in our schools, then I think that we can resolve those problems in terms of how we as educators approach that, then I think we will be moving a long ways toward righting the wrongs of race. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Jabari Mahiri for sharing his research today. Also, please join me in thanking our two educational leaders who took time out of their incredibly busy schedules to be co-presenters with us. And we have also in the chat asked for some feedback because we want to continue to provide content that's useful and also helpful to you as you do your work in the field. Finally, if you're interested in learning more about 21 CSLA or receiving notifications about future webinars, please sign up for our mailing list or go to our website. And we want to continue to engage with you. We invite your feedback. We invite your ideas. And most of all, we thank you for spending time with us and celebrate you for all that you're doing in education and all that you will do in this very tumultuous time. Thank you for joining us.